You ever have a moment where your whole world shifts in a single second? Where something happens, something small, almost unnoticeable at first, but deep down, you know nothing will ever be the same again. That was me. I never saw it coming. I never thought it could happen to me. But when my best friend's dad made a move, everything changed. I thought I knew him. I trusted him. This was a man I had known for years. A man who had always just been there. He was Sophie's dad, kind, funny, the guy who made dumb dad jokes and grilled burgers on the weekends. The man who told us to be safe when we went out, who gave advice like a second father. He was just there. Until one day, he wasn't just anything anymore. Until one day, I looked up, and the way he looked back at me, it was different. Too different. I told myself I was imagining it. That I was overthinking. That I was reading into things that weren't there. But the truth? The truth was staring me right in the face. It was in the way he spoke to me. The way his hand lingered a little too long. The way his words felt too personal. Too intimate. Too wrong. But here's the part one can't shake. The part that still keeps me up at night. I didn't stop it. Not at first. Not when I should have. Because for one split second, I felt something I wasn't supposed to feel. And once you feel it, you can't unfeel it. You can't pretend it never happened. You can't undo the moment when everything changes. By the time I realized what was happening, it was already too late. And the worst part? I don't know if I was the victim, or if I let it happen. This story isn't what you think it is. And by the time we reach the end, you won't believe what happened. Let's start from the beginning. It started so subtly that I didn't even notice. Or maybe I did, and I just didn't want to see it. I was in a bad place. My relationship had just fallen apart. 3 years, gone in an instant. I felt empty, like a part of me had been ripped away. I tried to act like I was okay, like I was moving on, but inside, I felt lost. Alone. Sophie was my escape. She had been my best friend since high school, the kind of friend who knew everything about me, who could make me laugh even when I didn't want to. Her family had always felt like a second home to me. Her mom was nice, but always busy with work, always on the phone, always leaving early and coming home late. But her dad was different. Mr. Carter was the kind of man people liked instantly. He was confident, charming, the kind of guy who always knew what to say. He had this way of making you feel heard, like what you said actually mattered. He wasn't just Sophie's dad, he was the cool parent, the one who made jokes, who actually talked to us like adults instead of treating us like kids. He had this energy about him, warm, welcoming, safe, and maybe that's why I didn't see it sooner. Maybe that's why I let my guard down. After the breakup, I spent even more time at Sophie's house. I didn't want to be home alone with my thoughts, and Sophie was the distraction I needed. We'd sit in her room for hours, watching movies, scrolling through social media, talking about nothing and everything. And Mr. Carter was always there in the background, asking how I was doing, offering to make us food, checking in like he actually cared. At first, it felt nice, like having a real father figure in my life. Someone who noticed when I was upset. Someone who asked how I was feeling and actually listened to the answer. But then, something changed. It was small at first. A look that lasted just a second too long. A compliment that felt a little too personal. "You've always been a beautiful girl, Emily. But you've really grown into yourself." Innocent enough. Except the way he said it made my stomach tighten in a way I couldn't explain. Then there were the little things. The way he always seemed to know what was going on in my life. "How's that new job working out? You said you were nervous about it last time." Or, "I remember you mentioning that you love vanilla lattes. I picked some up if you want one." Things I barely remembered saying, things I wouldn't have expected him to remember. I told myself it was nothing. He was just being nice. That was who he was. Always kind. Always thoughtful. That's why people liked him. That's why Sophie's friends always talked about how lucky she was to have a dad like him. But then there was the night everything shifted. The night I felt it, really felt it, for the first time. Sophie had fallen asleep early. We'd been binge-watching some show, and at some point, she knocked out, curled up under a blanket, her phone still in her hand. I wasn't tired yet, so I went downstairs to get some water. The house was quiet, dark, except for the glow of the TV in the living room. And there he was, sitting on the couch, a half-finished glass of whiskey in his hand. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice low, easy. I shook my head. He patted the space next to him. "Join me for a bit." "I won't tell Sophie you broke curfew." I hesitated. Just for a second. But then I sat down. I don't know how long we talked. It felt natural at first, comfortable. He asked about my ex, about how I was holding up. I told him the truth, that I felt empty, that I didn't know who I was without that relationship. That it scared me. He listened, really listened, in a way that made my chest ache. And then he said something that made my breath catch. "You deserve to be with someone who sees you for who you are. Someone who appreciates you. Someone who knows your worth." His eyes were on me, steady, unreadable. And for the first time, I felt something shift. I don't know if it was the way he said it, the way his voice softened, or the way he was looking at me. But suddenly, I felt exposed. Like he wasn't just talking to me, like he was seeing me in a way no one else had before. I laughed it off, made some joke about how relationships weren't worth the trouble. But my hands felt clammy, and my heartbeat was too loud in my ears. I excused myself not long after, retreating back to Sophie's room, lying awake next to her, staring at the ceiling, feeling something I couldn't explain creeping under my skin. I told myself I was imagining it. That it was nothing. That I was just being stupid. But deep down, I knew better. I tried to push it out of my mind. I told myself I was overthinking, that I was just imagining things. But once a thought like that plants itself in your head, it's impossible to ignore. And that weekend? That was when everything spiraled. Sophie had been talking about the trip for weeks, a weekend at her family's beach house. Just a little getaway, something to break up the routine. Her parents would be there, of course, but I didn't mind. I'd spent so much time around them, it barely felt different from being at home. When we arrived, the house was exactly what I remembered, warm, airy, the kind of place that felt like summer, even when it wasn't. Sophie's mom was busy as always, taking calls on the patio, answering emails between sips of wine. Sophie was already talking about hitting the beach, planning the weekend like we were kids again. But Mr. Carter, he was different. At first, it was small things. The way he greeted me, his hand on my back just a second too long. The way his eyes lingered when I left. The way he pulled out a chair for me at dinner, poured my drink before anyone else's. Maybe no one else noticed, but I did. And I hated that I did. The conversation at dinner felt normal at first. Casual. But somehow it always circled back to me. He asked about my life, about my plans, about things I didn't even remember telling him before. "You're still thinking about moving out of the city, right? You always talked about how much you hated the noise." Small things. Details that shouldn't have mattered, but coming from him, they felt different. Sophie rolled her eyes. "Dad, stop interrogating her." But he just smiled, leaned back in his chair, and said, "I'm just interested in her life." That's not a crime, is it? No one thought anything of it. No one except me, and maybe him. Later that night, I stepped outside for some air. The beach house was quiet, the air cool against my skin. The waves crashed in the distance, steady, rhythmic. I closed my eyes, tried to clear my head. But then I heard footsteps. Couldn't sleep? I turned. Mr. Carter was standing a few feet away, hands in his pockets, watching me. I forced a smile. Just needed some air. He nodded, stepped closer. "It's nice out here at night. Peaceful." I should have gone back inside. I should have said something, anything, to end the conversation. But I didn't. We stood there in silence for a while, just listening to the ocean. Then he sighed, a long, heavy sound, and said, "You know, it's funny. I've known you since you were a kid, but somehow I feel like I know you better now than I ever have." I swallowed hard. Well, people change, I guess. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and something shifted in the air between us. His voice was softer when he spoke next. "Yeah, you have. My heart was pounding. I told myself it was nothing. Just words. Just a conversation. But then he reached out. Just a touch on my shoulder, light, barely there. But it stayed. Just for a second too long. Long enough to make my breath catch. Long enough to make me freeze. Then he chuckled, like it was nothing. Like I was the one making it weird. If I were your age, I'd be chasing after you. I felt my stomach drop. I forced a laugh. A nervous, awkward thing. Good thing you're not, then. He smiled. Slow. Knowing. Then he stepped back, stretched like he was just another guy enjoying the night air, and said, "You should get some sleep." And then he walked away. Just like that. Like he hadn't just said what he said. Like he hadn't just left something hanging between us, thick and heavy and impossible to ignore. I stood there for a long time after he was gone, staring out at the ocean, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it. That it was just a joke. That it meant nothing. But deep down, I knew better. I barely slept that night. I kept replaying his words in my head, over and over again. The way he looked at me. The way his hand lingered on my shoulder. The way he smiled after saying something he shouldn't have said. If I were your age, I'd be chasing after you. It was a joke. It had to be. Just an offhand comment. But if that was true, why did it feel like something more? I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. That I was reading too much into it. But the next morning, when I walked into the kitchen, I felt it again. That same shift in the air. That same awareness. He was standing by the counter, sipping coffee, scrolling through his phone. Sophie and her mom weren't up yet. It was just the two of us. I should have just grabbed a glass of water and left. I should have acted normal. But the moment he looked up at me, I froze. His eyes scanned me, just for a second, just long enough to make my skin prickle. Then he smiled, easy, casual, like nothing had changed. "Morning," he said, his voice smooth, warm. Like he hadn't set something loose in me the night before. I nodded, kept my distance, reached for a glass from the cabinet. My hands felt unsteady, and I hated that they did. I hated that I felt something. "Sleep okay?" he asked. I swallowed. "Yeah, fine," he hummed, like he didn't quite believe me. "Good. You looked peaceful when I saw you last night." I went still. My heart slammed against my ribs. I turned to him slowly, my throat tightening. "You saw me?" He smiled, took another sip of coffee. "Yeah, before I went to bed. The door to Sophie's room was open a little. You were asleep." I felt lightheaded. Was I losing my mind? Was he trying to make me feel this way, or was it all in my head? I muttered something about needing to grab my phone and walked away, my pulse hammering in my ears. But even as I left, I felt his gaze on my back. I knew, without looking, that he was still watching me. After that morning, it only got worse. It was in the little things. The way he always seemed to be near me. The way he made sure to sit across from me at dinner, his foot brushing mine under the table. The way he leaned in when he spoke, lowering his voice just enough that it felt intimate, like a secret meant only for me. And then, the messages started. At first, they were harmless. Normal. "Hope you made it home safe. You left your sweater at the beach house. I'll make sure Sophie brings it to you." Nothing strange. Nothing that would make anyone suspicious. But then, one night, a message came in that made my breath hitch. I don't usually text Sophie's friends, but I just wanted to say, "I see you, Emily. You've been going through a lot, and I just want you to know, you deserve someone who truly appreciates you." I stared at my screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. My chest tightened. My stomach twisted. This wasn't normal. This wasn't something a friend's dad said. And yet, I didn't block him. I didn't ignore it. Instead, I read it again. And again. And again. It felt like a trap, but one I wasn't sure I wanted to escape from. I knew I should tell Sophie. I knew I should put a stop to it. But part of me liked it. And that part of me? That was the part one was most ashamed of. Because for the first time in a long time, I felt seen. Not like an afterthought. Not like someone who was just there. Someone was paying attention to me. Someone noticed me. And the worst part? I wasn't sure I wanted it to stop. It didn't stop. It should have. I should have drawn a line, should have shut it down before it turned into something I couldn't control. But I didn't. Instead, I let it happen. Slowly, carefully, like a game being played in the shadows, neither of us saying what we both knew was happening. Every time I saw him after that text, there was something there. A tension, a pull, something that made the air feel heavier when we were in the same room. I noticed every glance, every moment his eyes lingered too long, every time he found a reason to stand too close. And the worst part? I started waiting for it. The first real test came during a family movie night. It was one of those evenings that felt safe. Sophie and I curled up on the couch, popcorn between us, the glow of the screen flickering across the room. Mrs. Carter was barely paying attention, scrolling through her phone. Mr. Carter sat at the other end of the couch, relaxed, casual. Too casual. Somewhere in the middle of the movie, I felt it, the shift, the smallest movement. His arm resting behind me. Not touching, not obvious. Just there. The heat of him close enough that I could feel it. My skin prickled. My heart pounded. I told myself not to react, not to lean into it, not to let him see that it affected me. Then Sophie rolled her eyes and nudged him. "Dad, don't be weird." Laughter. Everyone laughed. Except me. Because she didn't see it. She didn't feel what I felt in that moment. The way his fingers brushed the back of my shoulder as he adjusted his arm. The way his body was just a fraction closer than it should have been. My stomach knotted. I forced a smile. Pretended like it didn't mean anything. But deep down, I knew. We both knew. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind wouldn't stop spinning. Every small touch, every lingering glance, it was becoming too much. I needed air, needed space. I slipped out of Sophie's room, made my way downstairs to the kitchen, hoping a glass of water would calm me down. But he was already there. The light above the stove cast a dim glow over the room. He was leaning against the counter, sipping a drink, looking deep in thought. When he saw me, he smiled, slow, lazy, like he had been expecting me. Couldn't sleep? I shook my head. Just needed some water. He nodded, watching me as I moved across the kitchen, his gaze heavy. I felt it, every second of it. I filled a glass from the sink, kept my back to him longer than necessary, hoping that when I turned around, he'd be gone. But he wasn't. I leaned against the counter, took a sip, tried to act normal. He studied me for a long moment before he spoke again, his voice quieter this time. Sometimes I feel like I'm living the wrong life. My breath caught. I froze, fingers tightening around the glass. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to respond. So I didn't. I just stared at him, my pulse hammering in my ears. He set his drink down, ran a hand through his hair, exhaled like he had just admitted something he wasn't supposed to say. "Forget I said that," he muttered, shaking his head. But I couldn't. The words sat between us, thick and heavy, impossible to ignore. I should have walked away. I should have ended it right there. But I didn't. Instead, he reached out. His fingers barely brushed against mine, the lightest touch, but it sent a shock through me. A simple, small contact, but it felt like a question. A test. A line crossed so carefully, so deliberately, that it barely looked like a line at all. My heart pounded. My throat was dry. I could feel the heat of his skin against mine, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. My mind screamed at me to pull away, to pretend like it never happened. But my body betrayed me. I didn't move. Then, footsteps. Upstairs. The sound of someone shifting in bed. We pulled apart instantly. The moment snapped, broken, reality crashing back down. He cleared his throat, grabbed his drink, avoided my gaze. I turned away, pretended to focus on something else, anything else. My hands were shaking. "You should get some rest," he murmured, his voice unreadable. Then he walked out of the kitchen, leaving me standing there, breathless, hands trembling, heart pounding. Nothing had happened. Not really. But everything had changed. I told myself I was in control. That nothing had happened. That I could still walk away, pretend it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew better. I knew we had passed a point of no return. We just hadn't faced the consequences yet. And then Sophie's birthday happened. The house was packed. Friends, family, music pulsing through the walls, drinks flowing freely. Laughter, conversations overlapping, the kind of night that felt alive. The kind of night where things blurred together, where you stopped keeping track of time, of faces, of the way the air shifted between one moment and the next. But I felt him. Even in a room full of people, I felt him. Every time I looked up, he was there. Not staring. Not obvious. Just aware. A glance here. A fleeting look there. Like a silent conversation no one else could hear. And then, somehow, we were alone. I don't even remember how it happened. 1 second, I was grabbing another drink, weaving through the crowd, and the next, he was there. The kitchen was dimly lit, the noise from the party muffled by the walls. I turned, and suddenly, he was close. Too close. His voice was quiet, but I heard every word like he was whispering them directly into my skin. I can't stop thinking about you. My breath hitched. My pulse pounded in my throat. I should have said something. I should have shut it down, walked away, laughed it off, anything but what I did. Instead, I just stood there. Frozen. Waiting. His hand brushed against my waist. Light, tentative, but deliberate. A touch that burned. "Tell me I'm imagining this," he murmured. "Tell me you don't feel it too." I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. Because I did feel it. I felt it in the way my body locked up, in the way the air between us seemed to disappear. In the way I didn't step back. I don't know how long we stood there. A second? A minute? It felt like forever, like we were trapped in something we couldn't undo. Like we had already made a choice, even if neither of us had said it out loud yet. Then, footsteps. Fast. Close. And before I could move, before I could fix it, before I could even breathe, she was there. Sophie. The silence was instant. The air turned thick, suffocating. I didn't have to look at her to know what she had seen. I could feel it. The betrayal. The disbelief. The slow, horrible realization spreading across her face. What the hell is going on? Her voice cut through me like a blade. My stomach twisted, a sickening knot forming in my chest. I stepped back, too fast, too guilty. Mr. Carter's hand dropped from my waist. His face was unreadable, but it didn't matter. The damage was already done. I opened my mouth, tried to find words that could undo what had just happened. But there was nothing to say. Nothing that would make it better. Nothing that would make it untrue. And then Sophie turned and walked away. She didn't yell. She didn't scream. She didn't throw accusations at me. She just left. And somehow, that was worse. Because in that moment, I knew I had lost her. I had lost everything. I stood there, breathless, shaking, staring at the space where she had been. My best friend. My anchor. Gone. And next to me, Mr. Carter let out a slow exhale, running a hand through his hair. Emily, I didn't wait to hear what he was going to say. I didn't want to know. Because it didn't matter anymore. It was over. We had crossed the line. And now, we had to live with it. The room felt like it was collapsing in on itself. My skin was burning, my ears ringing, my breath stuck somewhere between my lungs and my throat. Sophie was gone. Just gone. And I was still standing there, frozen, with the weight of everything crashing down around me. Mr. Carter was the first to move. His voice was steady, too steady, like he was trying to hold onto something slipping fast. She was feeling dizzy. He called after Sophie. I was just helping her. Lies. We both knew it. And so did she. Sophie didn't turn around. She didn't stop. She pushed through the crowd, straight toward the front door. I finally forced myself to move, my body feeling like it didn't belong to me anymore. Sophie, wait. She didn't wait. The door slammed behind her. The party didn't stop. Music still played, people still laughed, completely unaware of the wreckage happening in real time. I stood there, numb, my hands trembling at my sides. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Mr. Carter ran a hand down his face, exhaling sharply. Damn it. I turned to him, my voice barely working. What do I do? He didn't answer right away. He just looked at me, really looked at me, like he was seeing the reality of what we had done for the first time. Then he shook his head. Give her space. She'll calm down. He said it like he believed it. Like this could be undone. Like all I had to do was wait and Sophie would come back. But I knew better. I could already feel the crack widening, the irreversible shift between the world before and the world after. I needed to find her. I needed to fix this. I stumbled out of the kitchen, pushing past bodies, searching the room for her familiar face, but she was gone. I pulled out my phone, my fingers shaking so badly I could barely type. Me, Sophie, please. Let me explain. No response. Me, I swear it's not what you think. Please, talk to me. Still nothing. By the time I got outside, the driveway was empty. Her car was gone. And then I knew I had lost her. I don't remember much of what happened after that. Just flashes. Me standing outside, staring at my phone, refreshing our messages like somehow that would change the fact that she wasn't answering. Me walking back inside in a daze, the music too loud, the people around me a blur. Mr. Carter disappearing somewhere, like he could erase himself from what had just happened. I left before the party ended. I don't even know if anyone noticed. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my keys. The whole drive home, my mind raced in circles. What had I done? I knew I had crossed a line, but I hadn't expected it to cost me this much. I hadn't expected to feel this hollow, this sick, this wrong. When I got home, I tried calling her. Straight to voicemail. I tried again. And again. Blocked. It hit me then. All at once. My best friend was gone. Just like that. Years of friendship, of laughter, of shared secrets, erased in a single moment. I sat on my bed, staring at my phone, my body cold, my chest tight, waiting for something, anything, to make it feel less real. And then a message came through. Not from Sophie. From him. Mr. Carter, I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you. I stared at the words, my stomach twisting. The apology felt hollow, like an echo of something that couldn't be taken back. Like something too little, too late. I hovered over the screen for a long time. Then, without thinking, without hesitating, I deleted it. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at my phone, the empty space where his message had been. My fingers felt cold, my chest tight, my mind unraveling. What was that? What was that? I wanted to believe it had been nothing. A misunderstanding. A mistake that could be undone. But deep down, I knew better. I knew what I had felt when he touched me, when he whispered those words. I knew what had been building for weeks, slow and quiet and dangerous. And the worst part? I didn't know if I had let it happen, or if I had wanted it to. The guilt came first. A crushing weight pressing down on my ribs, making it hard to breathe. Sophie. Her face when she saw us. That look in her eyes, shock, betrayal, hurt, like something had cracked inside her, something I could never put back together. How had I let it get to this point? How had I been so blind? Then the shame crept in. The kind that burrows under your skin, that makes you want to crawl out of your own body. The kind that whispers in your ear, this is your fault. You let this happen. You could have stopped it. You didn't. I told myself I hadn't meant for any of this. That I hadn't done anything. But that was a lie, wasn't it? Because I had done something. I had let it get this far. I had felt something I shouldn't have felt. And I had let it keep going. I thought back to every moment I had ignored, every sign I had brushed off. The way he looked at me. The way he remembered little details about my life. The way he started texting me, carefully at first, like a fisherman throwing bait into the water. It had all been leading to this, hadn't it? And I let it happen because, for some reason, a part of me wanted it to. I hated myself for that. I wanted to tell myself that he had manipulated me. That I had been too vulnerable, too lost after my breakup, and he had seen an opening and taken advantage of it. That he had known exactly what he was doing. And maybe he had. Maybe he had been testing me all along, pushing boundaries little by little, waiting to see if I would push back. And when I didn't, He kept going. But then, the worst thought of all crept in. What if this wasn't just about him? What if, deep down, I wanted to be seen? What if I had been drawn to the attention, the way he made me feel special, the way he noticed things about me that no one else seemed to? What if it had felt good to be wanted? The thought made me sick. It made my stomach twist, made my skin crawl. Because what did that say about me? I thought about the moments I could have stopped it. The night at the beach house when he touched my shoulder, when he told me if he were my age, he'd be chasing after me. I could have told Sophie then. I could have blocked his number the first time he messaged me. I could have walked out of that kitchen before his hand found my waist. I had 100 chances to stop this before it ever reached Sophie's eyes. And I didn't. I didn't because I told myself it was harmless. That it was nothing. That I was strong enough to handle it, that it wouldn't go anywhere. That I could stand on the edge of something dangerous without falling in. But this is how it happens, isn't it? Not in one big moment. Not in a single decision that changes everything. But in 100 little moments that seem harmless. In glances that last too long. In words that mean more than they should. In the slow, quiet unraveling of boundaries until suddenly you're standing in the wreckage of something you can't undo. And now? Now, there was nothing left to do but live with it. So now I'm left with one question: was I blind? Or was I being played? I keep replaying everything in my head, every moment, every word, every look. I keep asking myself if I should have known, if I should have stopped it sooner. If I should have done something, anything, to prevent the fallout that followed. Was I just another naive girl, caught up in something too big for me to understand? Or did I let myself fall into it because, deep down, I wanted to feel wanted? I don't know. Maybe I'll never know. But I do know this: things like this don't just happen. They start small. They creep in when you least expect them, disguised as kindness, disguised as care. And by the time you realize what's really happening, it's too late. The damage is done. And all you can do is sit in the wreckage and wonder how the hell you got here. So tell me, what do you think? Was I just another girl who ignored the red flags, or was I being led down a path I never meant to take? Have you ever found yourself in a situation that blurred the lines between right and wrong? If you have, I want to hear your story. Let's talk in the comments. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to Shocking Infidelity Saga for more real stories like this. Because trust me, what you think could never happen to you. Sometimes it's closer than you think. Loneliness can lead us down dangerous paths. Stay aware. Stay safe.